So it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Rachel Schattman. She is an assistant professor of sustainable agriculture and a faculty fellow in the Mitchell Center. Rather than tell you what it says on the thing, I'm going to tell you my take on Rachel. She's uncommonly good at many different things. And that's not just me saying that. If you go to her LinkedIn page, the first thing you see on her skills is not just writing grants, but milking cows. Am I the only one in Maine who can't do both of those things well? Maybe I can't do either of them well. But let me tell you a little bit more about this. She knows farming because she was a commercial vegetable farmer for more than a decade. She has a breadth and depth of academic training that I have rarely encountered, and I've been around for a while, if you couldn't already tell. She has a sophisticated understanding of the principles of experimental design, which are key to identifying the myriad factors that influence crop production. She's also an expert in mixed methods research, which is this combination of qualitative and quantitative social science that are key to understanding human preferences and beliefs that shape decision-making. She knows a lot about how to connect university research with the needs of farmers, including the ways this doesn't always work the way we hope, because she's been a cooperative extension professional. The bottom line is that for much of the work the Mitchell Center does, and hers is a great example of this, it's not enough for universities to produce knowledge. We're pretty good at that, but we really need to spend more time thinking about how to align university research and other university capacities with the needs of farmers and other partners. And she's doing a great job of that, not just in her own work, but in producing the next generation of leaders who are committed to this work in sustainable agriculture. And you'll see all of this and much more in her talk today, the title of which is Dealing with Drought, Aligning Farmer Needs and Advisor Confidence, Skills, and Expertise. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Schattman.
Thank you very much, David. I will try hard to live up to that introduction. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you coming out today to listen to this talk. As David mentioned, my name is Rachel Schattman, and I'm going to be talking with you today about some work that colleagues and I have completed on looking at drought, yes, but also all of the different ways that farmers are challenged to address changing precipitation patterns that are because of climate change in our region. So we're going to be talking about drought overwhelmingly, but water management more broadly. Okay. The best science doesn't happen with one person alone. I'm really fortunate to work with a great team who I've put up on the slide here. So the folks who have worked with me on this project that we'll be hearing about today include Jonathan Malacarney from the School of Economics, Ellen Mallory from Cooperative Extension and the School of Food and Agriculture, Lily Calderwood, who is also similarly split between SFA and Extension, and Caleb Goosen, who is the crop specialist with Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. Our work is very much grounded in our relationships with people in the field who work with farmers every day, including the good folks at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and many extension professionals who have a direct relationship with farming communities around the state. So I just want to make sure that we I emphasize the grounded nature of these research questions and also hopefully the findings from this research. So when we talk about drought, I think sometimes there's some confusion about what that means. There are some very well-defined definitions of what drought is that mostly have to do with deviations from normal when it comes to precipitation amounts, either in snow form or rainfall form. But one of the things that I think can get both confusing for people and is nice to articulate out loud is that when we talk about different types of droughts, such as you see on the slide, meteorological drought, agricultural drought, hydrological drought, socioeconomic drought. These are about the effects that these deviations from normal have on ecological communities, plant and animals, and communities of people. These are obviously not mutually exclusive effects. They overlapped with one another. But for the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to be addressing primarily agricultural drought, which is, as I just said, when dry periods and lack of rainfall or snowfall have detrimental effects on crop production or livestock production. We're really fortunate in this country to have a resource called the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. It's a federal collaboration led by NOAA. And what they do is they make information about deviation from normal, about drought experiences, really widely available in some really neat user-friendly ways. They have great websites with interactive tools. And in the Northeast, they provide weekly updates in the summer. You can subscribe to their newsletter. It's really informative. They have been keeping track of drought conditions since the year 2000. So what you see up on the slide here are the years down along the bottom of the chart. And up at the top is the relative level of precipitation. And the darker color red is obviously, or maybe intuitively, a more severe dry or drought condition. So what you notice by looking at this is that we have a lot of variation year to year in the Northeast. We've historically been a very well-watered region, right? Agriculture has traditionally been rain-fed. We've traditionally had a very nice even dispersal of rainfall across the growing season. More and more commonly, though, we have to rely on irrigation because, as you can see, there are some frequent yellow spikes in there, which indicate dry periods. The thing to remember is that this is dry periods for a range of different locations. So even though one area of a state might be experiencing drought, another area might not, it varies year to year. But the main takeaway is that we had some pretty severe drought in the early part of the 2000s. Then we had a nice long period where we got pretty much sufficient rainfall during the growing season. And then in more recent years, in 2016, and then from 2021 forward, what we're seeing is more and more drought in general. This is not specifically agricultural drought on this chart, but it definitely affected the agricultural communities. Just to kind of be a little more explicit about what those designations are, the yellow to the dark red, you can see up here to the left that they range from D0, which is abnormally dry, crop growth is affected, but not necessarily severely so, all the way down to D4 or exceptional drought, which we very rarely see here and have very rarely seen in Maine history. Mostly the most severe thing that we experience is D3 or extreme drought. And the two things I want you to notice here is in D3, we're seeing widespread effects on agriculture, widespread reduction in crop quality and yield. But we're also seeing an uptick in business for things like well drillers, bulk water haulers, people who are coming in to help folks adjust because where they're used to getting water is not necessarily cutting it anymore. All right. So what do farmers, what is the farming experience when we are having these periods of drought, when they are kind of reaching these severe thresholds? If you remember a couple slides ago, I showed you there was some particularly dry periods in 2020. This was really important for Maine agriculture specifically. There were a lot of people who were negatively affected by it. So in the winter of 2021, in the year following that drought, colleagues and I tried to put together a rapid response survey that would go out to a wide range of agricultural producers in the state. This was a survey crafted by UMaine Extension, myself, some colleagues at the Department of Ag and Conservation and Forestry. And then because we work closely with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Farm Service Agency, they also gave us input into this survey, which was very helpful. For those of you who aren't familiar, those two agencies are the ones in the USDA that work the most closely with farmers on a frequent basis. So the map on the left kind of overviews where we got respondents from in the state. You can see we got a lot of people calling in from Aroostook County, which is explained probably by the large number of farms up there, specifically potato growers and brassica growers. And then on the right, you can see the number of respondents that we got by sector. I know it can be kind of small to see that y-axis, but you can see at the bottom are vegetable growers, potato growers, small fruit, and hay. The important thing to note here is that obviously people grow more than one kind of crop, right? So if you added all these numbers up, they would equal more than the 174 respondents that we got. The survey went out through several different listservs, and I think it was a really good learning experience for me to see what people called their listservs, like the Spudline listserv. I'd never heard of that one. It was great. We delivered the survey via Qualtrics, which has the ability to only give someone the option to take it once from a single IP address. So we tried to reduce the chances that people could take it more than once. But we tried to reach out to as many different types of producers as we could, understanding that there is such a wide diversity in agriculture in this state and that people were probably having various experiences. So some of the first things we wanted to understand, the substantive meat of this questionnaire that we asked people, is we wanted to get to the bottom of how bad 2020, because we knew anecdotally 2020 was a bad year for people, but how bad was it? Was it bad compared to the last 5 years, the last 10 years? So we asked folks to report on if they had experienced losses, yield losses, yes or no, in the period of 2015 to 2019, which is the orange or yellow dots to the left, and 2020, which are the green dots to the right. And what you can see from this chart is that everybody had a worse year in 2020 than in the 5 years previous, which were wetter, more reasonable kind of precipitation years. Two things stand out to me here. One is that there were some crops like wild blueberries where 100% of the respondents who took the survey who were wild blueberry growers reported that they experienced yield loss. Same thing for tree fruit growers. The other thing to note is just how bad the difference, or how big the difference was between 2015, 2019, and 2020 for maple producers. That's a really big gap. That makes you think that 2020 was a big difference for them. But how bad was it? That previous slide was yes or no. This slide is asking people to estimate their relative loss compared to their expected yield due to 2020's drought, but also other losses as well. And I'll explain that a little bit in a second. So what you see here are the sectors down along the bottom: vegetables, potatoes, small fruit, wild blueberries, tree fruit, etc. And then along the y-axis is the percent loss, again, relative to their expected yield. The little black bars in the middle of those boxes, that's the median loss for each sector. So there are some that are obviously more impacted than others, right? So we see small fruit and potatoes being kind of similarly affected, wild blueberries being more affected than others, and sectors like poultry, beef, and livestock being less so. The thing that I think is important to note here is because we are including other factors in here as well beyond drought, that it's worth noting that in 2020 for wild blueberries, there was a really late frost during the flowering period for this crop. So a lot of people lost yield because of the frost, and then it was compounded by the drought. Now, we all know that drought doesn't just affect yield, it has other effects on crops as well. So, for example, survey respondents also reported that they experienced poor crop and cover crop germination, increase in labor needs for irrigation because it takes away from doing other things during the season. And I see you all kind of squinting a little bit at that, so I apologize that the text might be a little small. Other effects like reduced crop quality, negative effects on crew health and well-being, erosion and soil loss. Some people reported that they ran out of water for their home well, which I think is important to note that especially for small farms, there are folks who are using a single well source for both their home and their farm needs. So impacts to one affects both kind of the quality of life for the farmer themselves and their farm operations. And running out of water for farm use as well. So what do we do about this? These are problems. We're going to talk about on-farm water management as a way to alleviate some of the stress that drought brings to farm operations. And when I talk about on-farm water management, part of what I'm talking about, this should say 1, 2, 3. This is one of the conversions from Google Slides to PowerPoint. We're talking about design and implementation of water source and delivery systems. We're also talking about regulatory compliance, and we're talking about navigation of the constraints of agroecosystems. So for this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on number 1 and number 3, although regulatory compliance is a big deal and definitely influences how well people are able to access water when they need it. But I also want to just pause and explain this third dot, the navigation of the constraints of agroecosystems, because I think it really illustrates how farmers can struggle during drought periods. So the example I have is people need to irrigate during the hottest part of the year, right? Generally, drought periods are affecting us in later summer, August, September. This is also the period of time when things like rivers are at their lowest, and where drawing water out of rivers for irrigation can potentially have detrimental effects on aquatic ecosystems. So there are reasons why you wouldn't be able to access water when you need it. Whatever farm intervention is kind of called for has to be put into the context of natural constraints of the ecosystem that that farm is based in. That makes sense? Okay, so this brings us to the first research question of the project, which is what kind of support, meaning information, technical assistance, or financial assistance do farmers want related to agricultural water management? I do want to pause and just differentiate between information and technical assistance. Information is intended to be much more general. It might be something like, when you are thinking about cover cropping, you would buy seed, you would till it in, you would have to think about termination, it would add biomass, all of these kind of general pieces of information. When we're talking about technical assistance, we're saying, hey, Eric, on your farm, you've got a 3% slope and clay loam, and your crops are coming out in July. Therefore, the cover crop mix that I'm going to advise you to adopt is X, Y, and Z. So something much more specific to someone's actual situation. And then obviously the financial piece is the resources needed to implement a given recommendation. When we talk about on-farm water management practices, we're often talking about a range of different things. So I just wanted to put together this slide to show you the practices that we asked about explicitly in the survey. I'm going to talk to you about 2 surveys today, and these practices were asked about in each. But there are a range of them. You can read, I'm not going to read through all of them now, but they're going to come up over the course of the presentation. So you can just kind of take a mental snapshot. When we asked people where they were interested in getting information or technical assistance or financial assistance, we asked them that question pertaining to each individual practice. And what we see is that there are some practices that can be categorized as soil and cropping practices, and others that can be really categorized as water practices. And the thing I want to emphasize here is that water management doesn't just involve water. You can bring water to a field, but if you don't have good soil health, if you don't have kind of a good cropping schedule, if you don't have good tillage practices, that water isn't going to make as big a difference. It isn't going to be as effective as if you do have good practices and good soil health in place. So that's why we kind of conceptually divided them into those two general buckets. It kind of helps you deal with a long list, be able to divide it up a little bit. So what we see is that there's a good portion of the survey respondents who are interested in getting information about a wide range of these practices. Now, we're surveying people who are growing a bunch of different things, producing a bunch of different things. So there's some of these practices that are going to be useful to a wide range of producers, and there's some that are not. So for example, planting or adjusting your planting schedules, that doesn't really matter to a maple producer. But it is really important to a field crop or a vegetable producer. But the thing that we wanted to really understand from this is not just across all ag sectors together, but among which agricultural sectors is there the most need. So the next couple of figures and diagrams that I'm going to show you are, they're a little bit big and complicated, but we're going to walk through them together. The first thing I want to tell you is that just like in the last slide, I kind of sorted the two practices into two general categories. That process was done just by like, I think this sounds like a cropping or soil practice. I think this sounds like a water practice. Totally just based on gut. Moving forward, what we did is we grouped the practices, but we did it in a much more rigorous way using a factor analysis based on people's desire for information, based on their desire for technical assistance, based on their desire for financial assistance. And what ended up happening is for information and technical assistance, we ended up getting the practices grouped into two categories, for financial assistance into four categories. You'll see what I mean in a second. All right, don't try too hard to read this. We're going to break it down. These are coefficient plots. Thank you to Jonathan for introducing me to these wonderful little guys. What they tell us is basically if people are responding differently to a question than the rest of the people in the survey based on a characteristic. So for example, this is an enlargement of one of those plots that I just showed you. This is farmers' desire for technical assistance, specifically about soil and crop management practices. And the way that you interpret this is by looking at the coefficients along the bottom. Each sector gets its own line. The dots indicate the point estimates for the beta coefficients, and the bars indicate the 95% confidence intervals. And basically, if a bar is completely to the right of that center line, what that means is that group is statistically significantly more interested in getting technical assistance about soil and crop management practices than people from other sectors. And if it's to the other side of the line, it means they're significantly statistically less interested. Does that make sense? Okay, lots of nodding heads. Good, excellent. So what we see from this is that other livestock producers, people who produce any other kind of livestock except for beef and chicken, they are more likely to want technical assistance about soil and crop management. They are also more likely to want information about water management, but so are potato growers. Hay growers, also very likely, but they cross over that line just a tiny little bit. So, you know, interpret that how you will. Potato growers are also more desirous of technical assistance about water management practices. So they want somebody to come and give them site-specific information relevant to their operation. And it's, again, just to emphasize, it's not that other people don't want this information. They just all kind of want it at the same level, whereas the potato growers really, really want it. We did the same thing for financial assistance, trying to figure out what people wanted. So again, I'm trying to read that too much. We're going to break it apart. Potato growers really want financial assistance for soil management practices. Potato growers really want financial assistance for water management practices. Potato growers really want financial assistance for water source development and covered practices. So the key takeaways from that are droughts affect people. They're affecting farmers in Maine in multiple different ways, including compromising yield, reducing crop quality, and reducing germination. When we look at what people want, we find that between 16 and 37% of farming respondents desire more information about the practices that we asked about. And there's a fairly uniform desire for soil and crop information from farmers across sectors. Producers of potatoes and other livestock have a strong interest in receiving information about water management. Between 11 and 24% of farmers desire technical assistance about the practices. Potato growers and those who raise other livestock are more interested than other farmers in receiving tech information about water management. Livestock producers, again, that same other category, want technical assistance about crop and soil management. And then lastly, between 7 and 28% of responding farmers are interested in receiving financial assistance, which in some ways is a silly question to ask, right? Because who's going to say, no, I don't want financial assistance? But there you have it. And what we find is that producers of potatoes, again, indicate a stronger desire than other farmers for financial assistance when it comes to soil management, water management, and water source development. And we're going to think about why a little bit later in the presentation. All right, reached the halfway point. So we're going to shift our attention a little bit to a different group of people. Now we're going to talk about agricultural advisors, which if you are kind of outside of this world can be a little bit jargony. What I mean when I say agricultural advisors is I mean anyone who provides a service to a farmer. So these can be people who work in the public sector, like extension professionals, state and federal agency staff, municipal officials. It can also be folks who work in the private sector. So you might have heard of certified crop consultants. There are people who work for seed, feed, and equipment dealers. And then there are also folks that we think of as serving a more general audience, of which farmers are one kind of group. And those would include people like well drillers, electricians, plumbers, and other tradespeople. And then we have nonprofit advisors, including industry associations and membership associations. One thing that I thought was really interesting when I was I dug a lot into the literature about who farmers trust for what purposes and where they get their information. And there was a really interesting study from 2013 that said, you know, people don't really care who you work for, it's what you know, which I thought was a lovely little piece as someone who's moved around a lot. The other important thing to keep in mind is that farmers trust each other. A lot of the time they say that farmers prefer to learn about sustainability challenges or adopting different practices from people who are themselves commercial farmers. So there's a peer-to-peer aspect of learning that we can't overlook. This brings us to the second set of research questions, which are really designed to kind of understand where in the community of farmers and agricultural advisors knowledge and expertise sits. So the questions are, what knowledge and skills do advisors believe that farmers currently possess? And are advisors confident in providing farmers with recommendations around water management practices specifically? This brings us to survey number 2, which was a regional survey conducted across the Northeast and funded through SARE, where Ellen is our state coordinator. So we were able to wrap that into one of her plans. It was fabulous. We had 381 valid respondents to this survey. We did have 54 respondents from Maine,
And we ran Kruskal-Wallis tests, which are essentially non-parametric chi-squares, to look at the statistical difference between the Maine respondents and those that came from outside of the state. We ran those tests on demographics and also on some key questions from the survey, and not finding any difference between the two groups. All of the information that I'm going to present to you in the rest of the slides is drawn from that larger body of respondents, so not just the Maine respondents. People reported working with a wide range of ag sectors, just as farmers could report working in more than one kind of crop. Ag advisors also report working across sectors as well. You can see that there are a selection of groups that these advisors reported working with that were kind of higher up on the list or more frequently cited. Those included vegetables and field crops and dairy and beef and ubiquitous other. To kind of set the tone, we wanted to know if the people who were responding to the survey thought of drought as a significant risk to farmers in the Northeast, because there is still that pervasive sentiment out there that the Northeast is a wet region. What do you guys have to worry about? You got enough water. So we wanted to kind of dig into that and understand if people thought that this was, in fact, something that was going to be a challenge for agriculture or was already. And what we find is if we ask people to rank their perceptions of risk on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being no risk and 5 being severe risk, the average risk score that respondents gave extreme precipitation and drought and changing weather were among the most severe. So people do think that this is an issue. Again, here's that list of practices that we asked about, just to kind of refresh your memory. We did a similar factor analysis to reduce this long list into some discrete categories. And we broke them down again using both the factor analysis and then regressing on, for this question, the ag advisor's perception that farmers have skills and knowledge that they need to be successful. So we'll take this one block at a time again. The first thing we wanted to know was how this related to soil management practices. And what we see here is that ag advisors who work with field crop producers believe them to be knowledgeable about soil management. Advisors who work with vegetable producers believe them to be knowledgeable about water source development, right? Because you can see that line for the vegetable producers all the way over and not crossing that 0 dotted line. And lastly, those who work with field crop producers believe that farmers have skills and knowledge necessary to deal with excess water management. We took a similar approach when we looked at advisors' personal confidence advising on these topics. And what we find here is that advisors who work with field crop producers, they themselves are confident talking about soil management practices. So that's a nice little alignment, right, between the farming community and the ag advisor community. When we asked about their confidence in advising on excess water management and water source development, we saw that those who worked with field crop producers and dairy producers and beef producers, this is a very overlapping group here, right? They felt confident talking about those issues with farmers. And then lastly, those who work with vegetable producers, and not statistically significant, but to a large degree small fruit producers, felt confident advising on irrigation and covered structures. So covered structures are like high tunnels, greenhouses, caterpillar tunnels, things like that. So the key takeaways from this section are that agricultural advisors do perceive there to be risk associated with not only drought, but also extreme precipitation, so both conditions. They also, this wasn't presented in a slide, but folks had a perception of themselves as not having a ton of expertise related to water-related skills. And in fact, only about 18% of the respondents said that they would know where to send a farmer if a farmer had a water-related challenge. However, there's a lot of interest in improving. About 76% of responders, of agricultural advisor respondents, said that they would like to better understand where to send farmers. And again, this is to kind of help us understand where in agricultural communities knowledge and expertise sits, where it's kind of hanging out. According to these survey respondents, the people who know about soil management are in the field cropping world, and it's not exclusive. This is like a gross simplification. People who know about soil management are in field crop producing circles. People who know about water source development are in vegetable production, and people who know about excess water management tend to be in field crop and dairy production. Again, big oversimplification, but I hope that you can kind of see where I'm going with this. In the agricultural advisor community itself, again, there's kind of similar buckets. Those who are confident advising on soil management tend to work with field crop producers. Those who are confident advising on water source development work with field crop dairy or beef. And those who are confident advising on irrigation and covered structures work with veggies. So this brings us into kind of the final stitching it all together piece. And the question is, are farmer needs aligned with what agricultural advisors can currently provide? So we asked people, again, if they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements. 1 was that they did not agree, and 5 was that they strongly agreed. We're going to take these bit by bit. So the first thing we wanted to know is whether or not advisors thought that currently in the community of advisors in the Northeast, whether or not there was sufficient knowledge and sufficient capacity to help farmers address water-related challenges. And we do see a relatively high degree of agreement. There are quite a few people who say, yes, I think there is that knowledge, there is that capacity in the Northeast. Although in follow-up analyses that we did on this question, we find that it's really bifurcated. So if you yourself are confident in providing recommendations to farmers in a certain topic area, you're more likely to think that that expertise exists in the region. If you're not so confident, then you're less likely to think that. So what that tells me is that there are probably different groups of agricultural advisors in the region, and they're not necessarily always aware of each other's skills or areas of expertise. Kind of moving down the line, we asked them whether or not they agreed if farmers have the support they need to effectively manage drought or dry periods, or effectively manage wet periods and heavy rains. So we see kind of still some kind of moderate agreement, but dropping. And then intuitively, perhaps we see a split here between these two questions. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? The first up at the top is the statement, climate change will necessitate that Northeast farmers adopt new and different water management practices. Lots of people say, yes, we need new approaches. At the bottom, there are folks who, we asked if people agreed with the statement that current practices were sufficient to help us deal with these challenges. And we see fewer people agreeing with that. So that makes sense. But the last one, and perhaps kind of important from a policy perspective, is we asked folks whether or not they thought that greater investment was needed in water-related agricultural services to meet the needs of Northeast farmers. So we had a high level of agreement about that. And when we talk about investment, what are we talking about? Well, no, I'm skipping ahead of myself. Let me save that for a minute. This is a kind of format that our team came up with that I think gets at the idea that we might have these different bodies of knowledge siloed in different communities around the Northeast or in Maine. Maybe NRCS really knows something about digging ponds, but people over here don't, and they need that information. Or maybe this group of farmers is really knowledgeable about setting up an irrigation system, but this group of farmers has no idea where to start. So how do we address this? Both thinking about level of need and interest, and also where the expertise lies. So we created this quadrant. The horizontal axis is skills and knowledge, with negative being down there, positive being over to the right. And then the vertical axis is desire for assistance. So how much do people want that information? How much do they want that technical assistance? And what we suggest is in the instances where skill and knowledge are low, but also desire for assistance is low, that's probably not a place that we need to invest a lot of time and energy because they're not asking for help, right? So maybe if there's any learning to be done there, it can be self-directed. There's lots of YouTube videos out there and lots of books to read. However, where you have low skill and knowledge but high desire for assistance, that's an excellent opportunity for introductory level outreach and programming. Sometimes we have the people who can teach those classes or teach those workshops or lead those groups, and sometimes we don't, or it doesn't seem immediately obvious who those people are. And so our suggestion is to look kind of across the diagram to the peer-to-peer education and cross-sector settings. So the people in the lower right there, those are the folks who really don't need assistance. They feel like they've got it under control more or less, but they have a high degree of skill and knowledge. And what we're proposing is that we do more to get people out of their comfortable little nests of their individual industry or their individual outreach program and bring them over to where there's the need. And that might necessitate some translation. It might necessitate some facilitation, but that there's a lot of opportunity there and that we have a lot of resources at our disposal if we are willing to kind of broaden our lens. The last thing that I wanted to say about this is that there is a harder nut to crack up in that upper right-hand corner, where people have a high degree for assistance, but they are also highly skilled already. And what that tells me is that those people are operating in a system where the tools that they have available and the knowledge that they have is not sufficient to help them adequately address the challenges that they are facing. Now, because I come to this with a certain lens, and I think that we could always use more research, I think that we maybe just need to ask different questions or explore options in different ways. However, it's really important that the people who would ultimately use new knowledge and apply new knowledge be involved in those processes, in the identification of a research problem, in determining how that research gets played out so that it's ultimately useful. And in some cases, this is because there's not really time to waste, right? Like we don't want to spend decades going down different avenues of different research projects that are not going to be ultimately usable to the agricultural community or communities that we serve. We need to involve them early on in the development process. So for an example, let's talk again about potatoes. So based on the surveys that we did, what we find is that agricultural advisors really do perceive this community as having a lot of skills and knowledge. And I think anyone who's worked with potato growers can attest to this, right? A lot of them really, really know what they're doing. They know their stuff. However, we see from the survey results that they also really desire more than other groups of growers, some pretty serious assistance. So not just information, but also technical assistance and financial assistance. Part of that desire might come from the fact that they are running much bigger farms than a lot of other industries in the state. And so the things that they need to invest in are often really big ticket items, right? Like if they're going to irrigate, they need a lot of water. They need a bigger system than someone who's running a 4-acre vegetable farm like I used to run. But it also, I think, illustrates that they are in a very challenging production system. Potatoes are really reliant on tillage, and tillage is really hard on soil quality, and poor soil quality is really hard on effective water management. So these folks are up against a big challenge, and there has been really good work done in the past on this. I know Eric and Ellen have both worked on projects related to this in the past. It seems like there are still opportunities to do more because it doesn't seem like potato growers are set yet. So thinking about financial assistance and where we can invest public monies to really assist farmers the most, I think it's a worthy question. There have been successful programs in Maine in the past that have helped growers put in ponds, drill wells, develop water sources to help them sustain drought. Those programs kind of, I think, flagged during the decade where we had a lot of consistent rainfall and have recently been resurrected. LD 1998 was passed last year by the legislature, and it authorizes a new farmer drought relief program. I'm currently working with the agency right now to do focus groups to figure out how people would like the state to spend money to help farmers, which has been a really interesting process. But we knew from the survey that there are some things that people do want financial assistance for, right? They want people to help, they want help with water source development, installing wells or ponds. They want help designing and installing irrigation systems. So it's not just enough to give people a check and say, here, go put in an irrigation system. There's a lot of complicated questions that need to be answered about pump sizes, pipe sizes, and delivery systems, and what sprinkler you get, and how much water you can move through a system, and how much water you even need for your crop. There is also desire for help with tile drainage, which is a complicated one, ditch work and water redirection, and then the big general bucket that is soil health. So there are a lot of practices that kind of fit underneath that bucket, but it's something that people care a lot about, and I think that people understand is inextricable from water management. So if you felt yourself falling asleep over the last 45 minutes, these are the three things that I hope that you will take home with you. One, that farmers want and agricultural advisors want and need targeted professional development opportunities that are specifically focused on those areas where they feel like they really need help. The second is that there is knowledge in different sectors, and that we can do more to learn from one another. And that might take some strategic planning, and it might take some investment from some key organizations, but it's a worthy use of time and resources, I think. And then lastly, that we are going to be looking at a situation where we need more financial resources, probably dedicated to water source development and drainage, and water diversion. And I know that's a little bit of a kind of, I'm finding this from my other research, maybe it isn't as explicitly connected to the survey results that I just presented, but I do think that is going to become a real need in the next couple of decades. So that is what I've got. Thank you very much. Hello, Linda.
Hey, Linda.
Should we go here first?
Yeah, if there are questions here, Linda, can I go first? You're muted, Linda, but I can tell what you said.
You bet.
Wait till you focus. This was on drought, but then you were talking about drainage and tiling at the end. And I'm just wondering, in a big picture, can you tell us about how farmers and their advisors perceive like the management and adaptation of extreme events? You know, so like 4-inch of farmers that are getting like more than one 3 or 4-inch rainfall event every 3 years versus the drought. Which are these equal problems? Is one worse than the other?
That's a really great question. Can people hear, or should I repeat back for the?
Probably good to repeat.
Okay. So the question was whether farmers and ag advisors are kind of perceiving both ends of the spectrum, both drought and extreme precipitation, as equally important, or if one versus the other was kind of precedent. Is that a good summary? I would say they see both as being precedent. And if I'm being completely honest, when we got the invitation to do this talk, this was the working title for the paper that Ellen and Jonathan and I and Caleb and I were working on. And then a week after I submitted the talk title, I think Ellen had the great suggestion. She's like, it's not really just about drought. Like, people are concerned about all of this range of, so I probably should have changed the title. Yes, people are concerned about both. And I think for those who aren't in agriculture, sometimes it's a big aha moment to realize that sometimes farmers are dealing with these two extreme challenges, even in the same growing season. So that's one of the extra special things that climate change means for the Northeast and the upper Midwest as well, is that we get both.
So equal.
That's what I have heard. I've never asked someone to rank them.
Well, you did though.
Oh yeah, the ag advisors, yeah.
I mean, and
Yep.
it is
It's very
trees
close.
Just the highest, just by a little bit, and then drought is a little bit.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't think it's 50.
So for those who are online, Ellen just noted that when we asked ag advisors about their perception of risk of the different climate change factors, that the drought factor and the extreme precipitation factors were very, very close.
So Linda, I think it's your turn and you just need to unmute.
Thank you. Rachel, what a fantastic talk. I am sure that everybody that's here is already thinking about who they can share this important information with that they heard, and that they're going to want to rewatch this once it's up because it is there's just so much terrific information here. You did just such a great job of saying that the best science doesn't happen with one person. That was a theme throughout what you talked about, and you showed us also how the science can be important in terms of experimental design and mixed method, and connecting the research with the needs of farmers. So one question is, would you show your slides to farmers? Would you show this presentation to farmers?
That's a very good question. Well, can anyone in the audience, is anybody here a farmer? Is anybody online a farmer? You never know. Yes, I would. Although I think that in my experience doing presentations with growers and talking with them about research results, they really appreciate getting to the quick of things a little bit more quickly than maybe we did in this talk. So, but yes, but in terms of like delivering the core messages, yes. And I will say, Linda, that I started my research career feeling embarrassed about presenting social science results to farmers because I assumed that they would have no patience and interest. And I have found that to be very much not the case, actually. That people are interested and invested in their community. And the farmers that I have worked with are very deep thinkers about these things. So yes, I would share it with them.
I grew up in Iowa. Most of my relatives are farmers. And one of the things that they had in Iowa, and I'm wondering about Maine, and if you can tell us about this, that in Iowa, the WHO, the big radio station, had a farm report every morning about, it was a mix of weather conditions, about the soil and things like that. Do we have something like that? And is it something that people would look to the university, for example, to be helpful?
That's a really great question, Linda. My sense from only being here for the past 3 years, and only working with a small slice of the agricultural community in Maine, is that there are a lot of different ways that people kind of stay in touch and get information about what's going on in the state. I do think that the extension agricultural newsletter that goes out, is it every other week? Every week, the one that Donna Coffin manages, that has incredible reach. A lot of people subscribe to that and get very good information about it. I especially like since they added Sean Burkle's little piece on climate and weather outlooks. I think that's fabulous. But that being said, part of the crux of this work is that I think people tend to communicate with their buddies. So maybe, we could stand, I think there are ways that people get information that are very sector specific. So the MAFCA people get their information through MAFCA, the potato growers get their information through the potato community, and that there's opportunity for selective work across those sectors specifically related to water management.
Great answer. One person was really interested in the point you were making about companies that could be helpful, and they asked the question, does Maine have companies who are ready to actually do ponds and water retention systems and the like?
If you had asked me that question a week ago, I would say there are a lot of people scratching their heads about who to turn to. And then I spoke with a hydrologist that works for the state, and she was like, oh yeah, well, you just hire like an engineering firm to go out and figure it out for you. There are a million of them around. So that it illustrates the point that I think there probably are a lot of people out there. They might not necessarily be targeting agriculture, but we could do more to connect them with the agricultural community.
And another person asks a great question of, what are the workforce needs in the ag advisor community? Do we need to recruit more people in this field, mentor, train the incoming generation? I mean, part of, just as an aside to that really great question, is my grandfather would constantly in Iowa complain about these ag extension people who would come and tell him how to farm. And he said, I've been farming, for 40 years. I know what I'm doing. And they're just getting a college education. So how do you tell us about all that?
Oh, that's a big can of worms.
Yeah, I know.
Well, first, let me address the workforce development question.
Great.
I mean, I do think that there is a need for people who can do things for farmers that they don't have time to do themselves. So yes, farmers are incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly resourceful, and in some cases, just brilliant problem solvers. However, farming is hard. It takes a ton of time. And sometimes I see the partnerships that we can develop between farming communities and a range of service providers as being a little bit of a spreading the burden, especially because there's also there's a difference in what we do, right? For those of us who do field trials and things like that, a farmer might not have the ability to wait over 3 seasons to collect a ton of data to do an in-depth analysis, but that doesn't mean they're not going to benefit from that level of rigor in research afterwards. So there's some complementary skill sets and some complementary ways that we are in the world. It's not a complete duplication. That being said, I think we all have kind of needs to reinvest in a new generation of service providers. Working for an organization like Extension, in my mind, is a bit of a dream job. I think it's a great place to be at this intersection between research and working directly with farming communities. How Extension professionals work with agricultural communities now, I would hope, and I think is very different than what your grandfather experienced. That there is a much more collaborative approach and a lot more information going back and forth as opposed to just technology transfer.
And this was Iowa State, and what can I say? We unfortunately have run out of time. You taught us all so much, and there's so much that we want to continue to learn from you in terms of how do you do research in this complex? How do you graph it and show it to people? What kind of mixed methods do you use? What length of time do you need to set up and how do you build partnerships? So thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge with us and helping us learn.
Thank Rachel again.
Thank you.
Yeah.